Some collections aren't just of objects, they're of souls. Welcome to the Ebonwood Collection, a museum of the strange and the cursed, where the night shift isn't just about security, it's about survival. My name is Caspian Hale, and I came here seeking quiet, a place to escape the shadows in my own mind. Instead, I found myself bound by 3 strange rules to survive a museum that is horrifyingly alive. What's the most unsettling object you've ever seen? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you dare to join me behind these velvet ropes, subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules and ring that bell, because once you step inside, you might just become a part of the exhibit. Let's begin. My fingers paused just inches from the crimson velvet rope. It wasn't just red under the museum's dim, antiquated lighting. It seemed to pulse with an inner glow, radiating unnatural warmth, a kind of slow, feverish heat that I knew, with a visceral certainty that had nothing to do with logic, didn't come from any normal source. And that's when my first night shift at the Atherton Collection began its slow, inevitable slide away from reality. My name is Caspian Hale. My life used to be quiet, meticulous work, the delicate restoration of antique books and manuscripts, coaxing secrets from faded ink and crumbling parchment. But one particular text, a volume bound in human skin, found in a collection no one dared name aloud, had changed things. It hadn't just shown me words. It had shown me images, sounds, feelings, things that lingered even after the book was sealed away. Now, I saw glimpses of unsettling symbols in blank walls, heard whispers in the rustle of normal paper, and sleep was a battle I was steadily losing. The lines between waking and dreaming, between sanity and something else entirely, blurring with terrifying frequency. I needed a job where I could exist in the quiet dark, away from the harsh glare of day that seemed to amplify the distortions. The Atherton Collection, a sprawling, Gothic mansion overlooking the cold, indifferent Maine coast, converted into a private museum of the peculiar and the cursed, offered just that. Mr. Blackwood, the museum's proprietor and my new employer, was a man sculpted from nervous energy and an unnerving enthusiasm. In his early 30s, dressed in tailored suits that seemed slightly out of place in the dusty halls, he had the look of a predator who'd just discovered a particularly fascinating specimen. His handshake was dry and brief, his smile wide but without warmth, and his eyes, the color of polished obsidian, sparkled with a strange, almost manic glee when he spoke of his exhibits. "Welcome to Atherton, Mr. Hale," he'd said, his voice high-pitched and eager as he'd unlocked the massive oak doors that first evening. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood polish, ozone, and something else. Something sweet and heavy, like wilted flowers in a faint metallic tang. A unique opportunity for a man of your discerning sensibilities. He'd known about my past, or at least enough of it. The tour that followed was a blur of shadowed galleries and silent, watchful artifacts. Blackwood strode through the halls, speaking of provenance and history, but his focus always seemed to be on the subtle energies, the resonances of the collection. He paused before a glass display case holding a collection of antique jewelry. "These pieces," he breathed, his voice dropping conspiratorially, "they don't just hold history, Julian. They hold memory, raw, potent. Sometimes they sing." He shivered, a quick, almost imperceptible movement, but his eyes gleamed. It was in the main exhibit hall, a vast echoing space filled with shadowed pedestals and velvet ropes, that he laid out the rules. His voice became serious, though that disturbing sparkle remained in his eyes. "Atherton has its peculiarities, Mr. Hale," he stated, his gaze sweeping across the silent, watchful collection. "The things within these walls, they are not inert. They require certain consideration for your safety and the integrity of the collection." I waited. The prickle of unease I'd felt ever since that ill-fated book Now, a cold knot in my stomach. First, he began, holding up a finger. Those crimson velvet ropes. They define the boundaries, yes, but they are more than mere barriers. They are permeable membranes. Do not touch them, Mr. Hale. Not inadvertently, not intentionally. They are warm, unnaturally so. I glanced at the nearest rope, its dark red seeming deeper, richer in the dim light. That brief, near touch earlier had sent a jolt through me. Second, he continued, his voice steady. You may find that some of the paintings weep a substance like blood, but not quite. If this occurs, do not attempt to clean it. Do not touch it. It spreads, and once it spreads, he trailed off, a small private smile on his lips. The collection grows. My mind flashed to images from that book, symbols drawn in viscous fluids. And third, his voice dropped again, almost a whisper, yet it seemed to fill the vast hall, drawing the shadows closer. The mannequins, particularly those in the costume gallery, they are receptive. Sometimes, Mr. Hale, when you look at them, they will look back. And the faces they wear may be your own. If this happens, whatever you do, Mr. Hale, do not scream. Do not scream. Do not show fear. They will take your place. He gestured towards a group of antique mannequins arranged in a tableau, their blank faces eerily uniform. As my gaze rested on them for a split second, the contours of one seemed to shift, the smooth plaster gaining a fleeting, disturbing semblance of me. My breath hitched. He handed me a heavy ring of keys. Miss Eleanor Vance, our daytime archivist, will oversee the transition until 9. She is traditional. Respect her methods. After that, Atherton is yours until dawn. An entire museum of history and mystery, all to yourself. His eyes gleamed. Enjoy the quiet, Mr. Hale, though I suspect you'll find it's never truly silent here. As he walked away, his footsteps echoing down the long hall, I felt a presence settle around me. Not just the silence of an empty building, but a stillness charged with unseen energy, a multitude of unheard whispers, and that strange, sweet, metallic scent, now stronger, wrapping around me like a shroud. My fingers trembled as I pocketed the keys. The first rule, the warm rope, already felt like a brand. The nightmare had begun. The silence of the Atherton collection was unlike any silence I had ever known. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the absence of normal sound. A profound quiet punctuated by things that should not have been there. The distant sigh of air that wasn't wind. The creak of a floorboard in an empty gallery above. The faint, rhythmic drip of something that wasn't water. It was a silence that amplified the frantic beating of my own heart, the ragged edges of my breath, and the persistent, low-grade buzzing at the back of my skull that had become a constant companion since the book. Miss Eleanor Vance, the daytime archivist, was a woman carved from caution and unspoken sorrow. She was a small woman, with gray hair pulled tightly back, and eyes that seemed permanently widened by a quiet fear. She spent the transition hour meticulously double-checking locks and whispering instructions about alarm codes and maintenance contacts. When I asked her about the history of the collection, her face would close off. When I mentioned the rules Mr. Blackwood had given me, her lips would tighten, and she'd just say, "Mr. Blackwood has his methods. It's best to follow them strictly." Before she left, she would always look at me with a deep, unsettling pity, a look that said she knew exactly what kind of night awaited me, and that she could do nothing to prevent it. One evening, as she gathered her coat, I saw her quickly, almost furtively, place a small, dried bundle of herbs, rosemary perhaps, or sage, on a pedestal near the entrance, before hurrying out the door. The red velvet ropes became an immediate focus of my morbid curiosity and rising dread. They were everywhere, snaking around exhibits, cordoning off sections of galleries. Even from a distance, I could feel a faint heat radiating from them, a warmth that had nothing to do with ambient temperature. One night, unable to resist a morbid experiment, I held my hand inches above one of the ropes dividing the curiosities of the occult exhibit. The warmth was palpable, emanating not just from the surface, but from within the thick velvet. It felt like life. Slow, sluggish, but undeniably alive. And then I felt something else. Something that bypassed my ears and settled directly into my mind. A faint chorus of whispers, not words, but raw, potent emotions. A wave of fear, followed by a flash of piercing pain, then a deep, bone-weary despair. It was like touching a nerve ending connected to the collective suffering of everything within that roped-off space. The rope itself seemed to tighten, almost imperceptibly, as if recoiling from my proximity. The whispers weren't always tied to the ropes. They drifted through the halls, faint, ethereal, sometimes sounding like distant, muffled cries, sometimes like secrets being shared just out of earshot. My existing auditory hallucinations, a byproduct of my insomnia and the book, made it impossible to tell if these were real or merely products of my increasingly frayed mind. Anya Harding, a local artist with a reputation for painting unsettling, abstract pieces inspired by the town's folklore, found her way into the museum one afternoon, ostensibly seeking inspiration among the exhibits. She was observant, her gaze lingering on details most visitors would miss. She struck up a conversation with me, her dark eyes sharp and intelligent. "You work the night shift, right, Caspian?" she asked, her voice low. "Must be interesting. Heard some stories about this place after dark. My grandmother used to call it the House of Held Breaths. Said things here, they don't just sit still." When I cautiously mentioned the peculiar rules Mr. Blackwood had laid out, particularly the one about the ropes being warm, her expression shifted. She leaned in slightly. "Warm, huh?" Grandma had some old tales about the blood ropes that they were woven from, well, things not of this world. Used to keep things in, or maybe, she paused, a thoughtful, unsettling look on her face, to keep things out. Or maybe to guide something, somewhere. She sketched a quick spiraling pattern on a napkin, the same pattern I felt under the surface of the ropes. Heard they feed on something, energy, or maybe attention. Her words, casual as they were, echoed the cryptic note I had found tucked inside a book in the museum's small, private library, a library where I spent hours poring over dusty volumes on folklore, forgotten rituals, and the darker corners of art, history searching for answers. The note read, "They are the conduits, the veins. Do not impede the flow. The warmth must be maintained. Maintained by whom? By what?" The red velvet ropes were not just barriers. They were alive, and they were waiting. "Yasuna, I see. I should matter. I thought I'll be up, can't shy. I came you. Oh." The nights blurred into a cycle of quiet patrol routes, the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the main hall, and the constant, low-grade hum of the building's unseen energies. My insomnia was reaching a critical point. The lack of sleep amplified the strangeness, making the shadows deeper, the whispers louder, the fleeting glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision almost constant. My carefully cultivated detachment, a skill learned from restoring centuries-old texts imbued with forgotten stories, was failing. The narratives here weren't just bound in vellum. They were bound in velvet, in canvas, in cold plaster, and they were demanding to be heard. The sweet, metallic scent I'd noticed on my first night became a more frequent, more potent visitor. It would waft through the halls in sudden, unexplained gusts, thick and nauseating, like cloying perfume mixed with the coppery tang of old blood. It seemed strongest in the galleries displaying paintings and antique costumes. It was in the Gallery of Painted Sorrows, a room filled with dark, brooding portraits and unsettling landscapes, that the second rule made its terrifying debut. I was doing my rounds, my flashlight beam playing over the silent faces in the frames, as the beam fell upon a particularly gloomy landscape, depicting a gnarled, skeletal tree against a stormy sky. I saw it. A dark, viscous liquid was slowly oozing from the surface of the canvas near the base of the tree. It was the same deep crimson as the velvet ropes, thick and gleaming under my light. It had that cloying, sweet, metallic odor, now overwhelmingly strong. It looked like blood. It smelled like blood, but it was coming from the paint. My first instinct, honed by years of meticulous preservation, was to contain it, to clean it, to prevent the damage from spreading. My hand twitched towards my pocket for a cleaning cloth, but Mr. Blackwood's voice, calm and precise, echoed in my mind. If the paintings bleed, don't clean them. It spreads. I froze, watching, a knot of pure horror tightening in my stomach. The liquid wasn't just spreading outwards in a simple puddle. It was flowing across the canvas, forming thin, dark lines, branching out like capillaries, weaving intricate, swirling patterns. And within the moving liquid, I could swear I saw fleeting, ghostly images, a face contorted in pain, a hand reaching out, a single wide eye staring back at me from the viscous pool. These were the narratives, made manifest, bleeding out onto the canvas. The painting seemed to pulse faintly as the liquid flowed, its surface shifting subtly. After a few minutes, the flow stopped. The liquid began to dry, leaving behind dark, angry-looking stains, deepening the shadows on the landscape. The painting looked hungrier, more alive. Miss Eleanor Vance found me staring at the painting the next morning, long after my shift should have ended. Her eyes widened when she saw the stain. She didn't ask what had happened. She just looked at the painting, then at me, with that familiar, deep sadness. "It wants to be told, Caspian," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "The story, the pain. The canvas hungers for it, and cleaning it just encourages it, like watering a weed that feeds on sorrow." She confided in me, her voice low and urgent, that she had worked at Atherton for over 30 years, since before Mr. Corvus Blackwood inherited it. She'd seen things, people who worked the night shift. They changed. Some just left. Some didn't. Her own nephew, a young man who had worked security here years ago, had vanished without a trace. She believed he was still here, somewhere within the collection. Anya Harding, when I later spoke to her about the bleeding painting, presenting it as a theoretical scenario based on local legends, listened intently, her dark eyes gleaming. "Bleeding paintings? That sounds like the artist's touch from the Blackwood folklore," she said. "They say the original Blackwoods, the ones who built this place, they weren't just collectors. They were alchemists of paint and flesh. They believed they could capture life, emotion, even consciousness, and bind it to objects. The blood, it's not blood. It's the essence, the concentrated narrative. And once it's out, it looks for a new canvas, a living one." Her gaze was unnervingly direct. "Be careful, Caspian. Some stories are infectious." Her words resonated with the unsettling knowledge I carried from the book that had derailed my life. Some texts, some images, they held more than just information. They held power. The Atherton Collection was a museum of bound narratives, and paintings were their weeping eyes, their open wounds. And I, with my fragmented mind and my inability to sleep, felt terrifyingly vulnerable to their silent pleas and their contagious sorrow. The museum was changing, becoming less of a building and more of a living, breathing entity, and its hunger was growing. Sleep became a cruel joke, a teasing whisper of oblivion that always retreated before I could fully grasp it. The constant vigil, the escalating strangeness, the ever-present scent of chemical sweetness and decay. It was wearing me down, eroding the last vestiges of my rationality. The whispers were louder now, sometimes forming discernible words, fragments of sentences, pleas, accusations, names I didn't recognize. My peripheral vision was a constant blur of fleeting shapes, of figures standing just beyond the edge of sight, melting away when I turned to look. The silent witness. That's the name that came to me, unbidden, for the presence I felt most acutely. Not one of the bound narratives, but something observing, something quiet and watchful, lurking in the blind spots between the exhibits. It felt like a pressure in the air, a sudden unnatural silence that would fall in a room, chilling me to the bone. The mannequins, they were everywhere, dressed in period clothing, arranged in static tableaux. Some were antique, their plaster faces chipped and expressionless. Others were more modern, disturbingly lifelike, their eyes staring blankly ahead. Mr. Blackwood had mentioned they were receptive. I'd initially dismissed it as macabre humor until it happened. I was conducting my late-night rounds through the E-costume and character gallery, a long, dimly lit room filled with display cases and freestanding mannequins. My flashlight beams swept across a group arranged in a drawing room scene from the Victorian era. As the light settled on one particular mannequin, a woman in a dark velvet gown, I felt that familiar, suffocating silence descend. The air grew cold, and then her face, it began to ripple, like water disturbed by a dropped stone. The smooth, featureless plaster gained definition, contour. It was not a face I recognized from history books or news reports. It was my face, reflected back at me from the unyielding plaster. Contorted not in recognition, but in the raw, naked terror I felt deep within. The exhaustion and the creeping madness etched onto its features. It was my face, but wrong, like a poorly cast mask, and its plaster eyes, fixed on mine, held a chilling, alien intelligence. A powerful, visceral urge to scream rose in my throat, a primal need to expel the horror, to break the suffocating silence. My lungs burned, my hands trembled, itching to smash the glass display case, to shatter the thing that wore my face. But Blackwood's words, clear and cold, echoed in my mind, cutting through the panic. "Don't scream. They'll take your place," and woven into the edges of my own rising panic. I heard other whispers, weak, desperate, seemingly emanating from the other mannequins in the room. "Don't scream. He's waiting for the sound. Our places. They took our places. Don't let him." He, the silent witness, or Blackwood, or the artist. They needed the scream. It was the key. I bit down hard on my lip, tasting copper, focusing on the pain, forcing my trembling body to remain still. I fixed my gaze on the mannequin, refusing to break eye contact, trying to project. Nothing. Emptiness. Silence. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The face on the mannequin remained, a horrifying mirror of my own terror. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with anticipation. Then, as slowly as it had appeared, the face began to recede, melting back into the smooth, featureless plaster. The uncanny intelligence faded from its eyes, leaving only blankness. The suffocating silence lifted. The room felt empty once more. Shaking, I stumbled back, leaning against a display case, trying to catch my breath. The other mannequins stood motionless, innocent in their rigid poses. But I knew they were watching and waiting. Later that night, Anya Harding appeared at the back employee entrance, her face grim. She wasn't looking for inspiration tonight. "Caspian," she said, her voice low, urgent. I dug deeper. My grandmother had some old family records. The Blackwoods weren't just collectors. They had a tradition, a living collection. People, they believed certain people with certain sensitivities could be preserved, made into works of art. She held up a brittle, yellowed photograph. It showed a group of people posing stiffly. In the background, partially obscured, was a mannequin. Its face, it looked eerily like one of the people in the photo. And next to the photo, she laid a small, faded newspaper clipping. A missing person report from decades ago. The person in the photo was the missing person. "Those people who vanished, Caspian," Anya whispered, her dark eyes wide with horror and certainty. "They're not gone. They're still here. They're the collection, and I think..." She looked towards the dark exhibit halls, her voice trembling. "Mr. Alaric Blackwood is looking for a new piece. Maybe he's found one." Blackwood's face, when I saw him near dawn, wore that disturbing, expectant smile. "A long night, Mr. Hale?" he asked, his eyes gleaming. "I trust you found the exhibits engaging. Some are more interactive than others. But remember the rules, Julian, especially the third one, the scream. It's the final brushstroke. The moment the canvas accepts the paint." He knew. He hadn't just given me rules. He'd given me instructions on how to become a part of his collection. The terror, the struggle for silence, it was all part of the process. And I, the insomniac restorer of old stories, was becoming the next unwritten narrative, bound in velvet, painted with sorrow, and displayed for the silent witness to admire. The museum wasn't just haunted. It was a living, growing, terrifying work of art, and I was next in line for the final exhibit. The air in the Ebonwood Collection was thick enough to chew. It pulsed with an unseen energy, humming with a low, discordant frequency that resonated in my teeth and vibrated through the soles of my feet. Tonight was different. A storm raged outside, not of wind and rain, but of pure, atmospheric pressure and disorienting static, rattling the old mansion down to its foundations. It felt like the sky itself was screaming, and the museum was answering. This was the event Anya had read about in the Blackwood family journals. The night when the veil thinned, when the collection became active. All three rules were in violent effect. The red velvet ropes weren't just warm. They were hot to the touch, glowing with a deep, internal crimson light, writhing subtly like thick, sluggish veins. The whispers emanating from them were no longer subtle emotions, but a cacophony of desperate voices, 1,000 cries of terror, pain, and pleading, all layered over each other. In the gallery of painted sorrows, the canvases weren't just bleeding, they were hemorrhaging. Thick, viscous crimson liquid, smelling overpoweringly of lilies and metal, gushed from the paintings, pooling on the floor, slithering outwards like dark tendrils. Within the flowing substance, faces twisted in agony, mouths opened in silent screams, eyes stared out with vacant horror. The paintings themselves seemed to bulge and warp, their surfaces shimmering like disturbed water. And the mannequins were moving. Slowly at first, a stiff, lurching gait, their plaster joints creaking with disturbing realism. Their blank faces were gone, replaced by a terrifying gallery of expressions. The wide-eyed terror of sudden realization, the blank stare of utter despair, the slack-jawed emptiness of a mind broken. Some of them wore faces I recognized from Anya's research, faces of the missing. Others, Others were shifting, attempting to form my own face again, or Anya's, or Miss Vance's. Their movements were accompanied by that suffocating silence, the presence of the silent witness. It felt like its cold, invisible hand was pushing them forward, directing them. Miss Eleanor Vance found me near the main hall, her face a mask of terror, a heavy brass candelabra clutched in her trembling hands. "It's the night of the confluence, Caspian," she shrieked, her voice thin and reedy against the overwhelming din of the whispers and the storm outside. "The collection is harvesting. He means to add more pieces." Anya burst from the shadows of the library, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, a determined glint in her eyes despite her obvious fear. "I found more in the journals. The collection feeds on resonance, emotional resonance, fear, pain, and the act of being observed. The silent witness isn't just watching. It requires witnesses. And the scream isn't an invitation. It's an anchor. It binds you to the moment, makes you a perfect canvas for the artist." Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the main exhibit hall creaked open, and Mr. Alaric Blackwood entered. He was no longer the eccentric collector. His eyes blazed with a feverish light, his posture unnaturally straight. He held a small, antique silver tray, empty save for a delicate, sharp carving tool. "The collection is ready," he announced, his voice resonant, layered with a quality that was disturbingly similar to the whispers from the ropes. "The narratives are flowing. The canvases are prepared, and the witnesses are watching. All that remains is the final stroke." He looked at me, that predatory gleam in his obsidian eyes intensified 1,000-fold. "You, Mr. Hale, your unique blend of fragmented reality and exquisite terror. You are the perfect medium for the new exhibit, a masterpiece of suffering." He advanced, the carving tool glinting in the dim light. The mannequins around us lurched forward, their creaking joints a counterpoint to the symphony of whispers, their shifting faces locked onto mine. The ropes pulsed hotter. The bleeding paintings seemed to pulse in time. The silent witness felt like a vast, invisible weight pressing down, observing, waiting for the scream. This was it, the collector's showcase, and I was meant to be the centerpiece. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, to break through my defenses, to force the scream that would seal my fate. But Anya's words, Miss Vance's terror, the horrifying reality of the moving mannequins, they solidified my resolve. I wouldn't scream, not for him, not for them. My mind, honed by years of dissecting ancient texts, of seeing the layers beneath the surface, raced. The narratives crave to be told. The witness craves to observe. The scream is an anchor, the warmth, the bleeding. The faces, their manifestations, conduits. How to disrupt a conduit. How to break an anchor. Tell a different story. The thought flashed through my mind, inspired by the very books I restored. "The crimson is a lie," I yelled, my voice raw but strong, cutting through the cacophony. "It's not blood. It's ink, poisonous ink, designed to bind, not to nourish." I grabbed a small brass exhibit placard from a nearby display. "These errant witnesses, they're prisoners, trapped narratives, forced to replay their pain for your sick voyeurism, Blackwood. And you," I pointed the placard at a particularly aggressive mannequin whose face was twisting into a grotesque mockery of mine. "You are not me. You are just an empty shell filled with borrowed sorrow." My words, not a scream of terror, but a defiant declaration, seemed to confuse the bound narratives. The whispers faltered for a moment. The moving mannequins paused, their jerky movements stuttering. Blackwood snarled, abandoning his calm facade. "Silence! You understand nothing. You will not defile the collection." He lunged. Miss Vance, with a courage I wouldn't have expected, swung the heavy candelabra, catching Blackwood across the arm. He cried out, staggering back, the carving tool clattering to the floor. The silent witness, the unseen presence, seemed to react to this physical violence, this disruption of its carefully orchestrated show. The pressure in the air intensified, a silent scream of pure, focused malice emanating from everywhere. Anya, meanwhile, had scrambled towards the power breaker for the main exhibit hall, hidden behind a large tapestry. "Light!" she yelled. "They hate the light. It burns the narratives." She threw the heavy switch. The overhead lights in the exhibit hall blazed on, harsh and sudden, a stark contrast to the usual dim illumination. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The crimson glow of the ropes dimmed. Their writhing lessened. The bleeding painting seemed to recoil, the flow of crimson liquid slowing, then stopping. The moving mannequins froze, their joints locking with a series of sharp snaps, their grotesque faces solidifying into fixed masks of horror. The overwhelming whispers faded, replaced by faint, whimpering sounds. Blackwood, blinded by the sudden light, roared in frustration. "No! The ritual! The confluence! You've broken it!" But the silent witness was still here. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, cold and suffocating, and it was angry. It wasn't just focused on me anymore. It was focused on us, on Anya, on Miss Vance, on Blackwood himself, anyone who had disrupted its showcase. The air around Blackwood shimmered, distorting, and then, with a soft, implosive gasp, a wave of pure silence, a void of sound and sensation, radiated outwards from him. He crumpled to the floor, not screaming, not crying out, just gone, as if he had been absorbed into the silence itself. His elegant suit lay empty on the floor, a discarded piece of clothing. The terror didn't lessen. It merely changed form. The aggressive chaos of the bound narratives was gone, replaced by the absolute, terrifying stillness of the silent witness. We were alive, but the thing that had been watching was still here, and it had just collected its most recent piece. The silence in the Atherton collection after Alaric Blackwood's terrifying absorption was absolute. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the building, leaving behind a vacuum of sound and life. The storm outside seemed to vanish with him, the wind dying down, the distant roar of the ocean becoming the only natural sound to fill the void he left behind. The museum was a scene of eerie stillness. The red velvet ropes were limp and cool to the touch. Their vibrant crimson faded to a dull, rusty red. The bleeding paintings were still, the crimson stains dried and dark, but the twisting, fluid patterns were fixed, like horrifying tattoos on the canvas. The mannequins were frozen in place, some locked in their final, grotesque expressions of fear or despair, others with their faces still disturbingly blank. Alaric Blackwood's suit lay empty on the floor, a silent testament to his horrifying end. Miss Eleanor Vance and Anya Harding stood beside me, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. We had survived, but the reality of what had transpired was almost too much to bear. The whispers were gone. The feeling of being watched was gone. For now. Miss Vance, her voice barely a whisper, pointed to the empty suit. He became one of them. A piece for the collection. A piece for the collection. Her nephew, her missing nephew. I saw the dawning horror in her eyes as she realized what might have happened to him. Anya, ever the artist, looked at the static, terrified faces of the mannequins with a macabre fascination. The scream, The anchor, she murmured, more to herself than us. Maybe they couldn't take your place, Caspian, because you didn't scream. You didn't anchor your terror to the moment. We spent the next few hours in a daze trying to piece together what had happened, and what we would tell the authorities. A break-in, a psychotic break on Alaric Blackwood's part. The truth was simply too outlandish. Dr. Grafe's words about preserving historical integrity while acknowledging local lore came back to me. Some truths were best filtered. We decided on a story built around Alaric Blackwood's descent into madness, perhaps fueled by his obsession with the collection and the isolation. A struggle had ensued. Evidence of the bleeding paintings and the moving mannequins. Well, in the chaos, perhaps things had been knocked over, paint cans spilled. The empty suit, harder to explain. We settled on a theory of him perhaps having fled into the storm, leaving his coat behind, or maybe having suffered a heart attack and somehow vanished into the surrounding woods in his delirium. It was weak, but it was plausible enough for a remote town with a history of strange occurrences. Miss Vance insisted on retrieving Alaric Blackwood's journals and some of the more disturbing artifacts that hadn't been explicitly part of the main exhibit. "They can't stay here," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. Not for the wrong eyes to find. She entrusted them to Anya, whose earlier initiative and genuine desire to understand had proven her capable. When the local police arrived the next morning, followed by the county sheriff, we stuck to our story. The officers, though skeptical about some details, the empty suit, the inexplicable damage, seemed almost resigned. Crimson Hollow had its share of strange tales, and the Blackwood Museum had always been at the center of them. They secured the building, launched an investigation into Alaric Blackwood's disappearance, and began the long, complicated process of documenting the site. As I left the Ebonwood Collection, the morning sun painting the old mansion in deceptively warm light, I looked back at the silent building. The stillness inside felt different now. Not just empty, but expectant, like a stage waiting for the next performance. The silent witness was still there. I could feel its vast, unseen presence observing and waiting for its next piece. It's been nearly a year since that night at the Ebonwood Collection. The museum remains closed, tied up in legal battles and investigations that are going nowhere. Alaric Blackwood is still officially a missing person, though the local theories range from having been lost in the storm to having simply abandoned his life and fled. Only Miss Vance, Anya, and I know the chilling truth. Miss Vance retired shortly after, her face holding a peace it hadn't known before, perhaps having finally found some closure regarding her nephew. She sends me a quiet nod of recognition whenever we pass on the street, a shared acknowledgement of the horrors we witnessed. I left Crimson Hollow a few weeks later. The quiet of the town, the way people avoided looking at the old mansion on the hill, felt too heavy, too knowing. I'm back to restoring books and manuscripts, the familiar scent of old paper, and binding glue a comfort. But the work is different now. I find myself looking at the intricate illustrations, the faded marginalia, with a new, unsettling intensity. I look for the patterns, the symbols, the hidden flows of energy. I look for the stories that are too raw, too potent to be just ink on paper. My sleep hasn't improved. The virtual reality of my dreams now includes dimly lit museum halls, the suffocating silence of the silent witness, and mannequins with faces that shift and writhe. Sometimes, I see Alaric Blackwood's blank, wide-eyed face among them. Sometimes, I see faces I don't recognize. Faces of other missing people from other towns. Other times, Anya Harding and I keep in touch. She's become a successful artist, her work dark, abstract, and deeply unsettling. Her pieces, exhibited in galleries in Boston and New York, feature swirling crimson patterns, figures with distorted faces, and an unnerving sense of being watched. Critics call it powerful, raw, a visceral exploration of the human condition. I call it familiar, disturbingly familiar. I've seen the crimson flow in her paintings. I felt the stillness radiating from her sculptures. She sends me photos of her new work, sometimes in the reflection of the glass framing one of her pieces. I see a fleeting glimpse of a face that shouldn't be there. I wonder if she sees it too, or if she's becoming the next conduit for the crimson artist. The journals of Alaric Blackwood, along with some of the less overtly supernatural artifacts Miss Vance and I salvaged, are now in my possession. Anya and I study them. They are filled with cryptic notes about the bound narratives, the witness, and the artist's palette. The process of collecting human emotion and experience and binding it into physical form. Blackwood believed the Ebonwood Collection was just one gallery in a much larger, unseen museum, curated by the silent witness itself, and that the pieces were waiting to be displayed to an unknown audience. One entry chilled me to the bone. It was about the third rule, the mannequins and the scream. Blackwood wrote about how the scream, the moment of ultimate terror and vulnerability, didn't just anchor the victim to the spot. It allowed the witness to create a perfect mold of their essence, their fear, to be transferred to a suitable vessel, a mannequin, and the victim. Once the mold was complete, they were freed from their physical form, becoming a raw, unbound narrative, ready to be absorbed back into the collection's energy flow, perhaps to manifest later as a whisper, a smell, or a fleeting image in another painting. The last entry in the journal is not in Blackwood's hand. It's in a script I recognize, meticulous and precise, yet shaky. It's a fragment, written after the night he disappeared. The artist collects, the witness watches, and the collection, it hungers. It remembers the face that did not scream. It was Miss Eleanor Vance. She'd returned to the museum sometime after we left that morning, and she knew I hadn't screamed. Sometimes, when I'm working late at night, surrounded by old books, the silence of my apartment feels heavy, expectant. I find myself looking at the faces in old photographs, in illustrated texts, searching for something that wasn't there before. I check the mirrors quickly, hoping not to catch a glimpse of a face that isn't my own staring back. I still struggle with insomnia, but now I'm afraid to fall asleep, afraid of where my mind might wander, afraid of what kind of narratives I might encounter or become. The Ebonwood Collection may be closed, its doors barred, but the museum is still open. It's just elsewhere. And I, Caspian Hale, the restorer of old stories, the man who didn't scream, am a piece in its vast unseen gallery. A piece that the silent witness is still watching and waiting to fully collect. The Ebonwood Collection, it keeps its secrets and its guests close. Caspian Hale thought he was just working a job, but he became a part of a far more terrifying narrative. The collector is gone, but the witness is still watching, and the collection is always growing. Seriously, if you haven't watched until the very end, you've missed the chilling truth. The legacy of the Ebonwood Collection that extends far beyond its walls. The final reveal will leave you with a profound sense of dread. What do you think the silent witness truly is? What happened to the people in the collection? Share your theories in the comments below. And if you survived the night shift, if the whispers haven't claimed you, then you are a part of our community now. Subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules, because some collections, they never truly close, and the artist is always looking for new pieces.